Questions without notice. Are there any questions? I'll give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister promised Australians cheaper mortgages. Sorry.
Just ask the Leader to pause for a moment and return to his question. I'll call the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I thank the Leader of the Opposition. Just I inform the House that the member for Rankin is absent from question time today, and I'll answer questions on his behalf.
Questions without notice. Give the call to the Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
No one's got a problem with that, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my questions to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister promised Australians cheaper mortgages, but since his election, interest rates have gone up 10 times, the fastest rise in history. The Prime Minister promised a $275 cut to your power bill each year before the election, but Labor's intervention in the gas market is causing prices to skyrocket. The Prime Minister promised families would be better off, but the cost of living crisis has never been worse. Why do Australians always pay more under Labor?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question. We did promise, and we are delivering on making a difference to people. We're making a difference with the cheaper medicines policy that we brought in on January 1, making an enormous difference and contrasting with the person who asked the question, which when he was Health Minister wanted to jack up the price of essential medicines by $5 per script. There's a contrast.
Order.
Cheaper childcare starts from July 1.
Order.
When the legislation was carried, the shadow finance minister said this: "It's certainly not the policy that we would have introduced." Never a truer word was said. Never a truer word was said. On July 1, we're expanding paid parental leave to 6 months. Now, the Leader of the Opposition was a senior minister in the former government which repeatedly tried to cut government-funded paid parental leave for tens of thousands of families. We said we'd get wages moving again. But those opposite voted against the Secure Jobs Better Pay legislation. And when we said that the minimum wage should be increased by just $1 an hour, they said it had wrecked the economy. Wrecked the economy. That it was reckless.
Order.
That it was reckless. We said about the energy price relief plan, who in the question, which of course is complete.
The member for Fairfax will cease interjecting.
Complete nonsense that somehow the cap
members on my left
on gas and coal that we introduced in conjunction with state and territory governments, Labor and Coalition, wasn't working. Well, that's not what the Australian Energy Market Operator said on the 28th of April, when they said wholesale spot prices averaged $83 megawatt for the March quarter, down from $93 and $216 in the previous December and September quarters. Our plan is working there. And similarly, the regulator, Claire Savage, said this on the 20th of April. Our latest quarterly wholesale report for January to March shows forward-based future prices for electricity initially stabilised during the early part of 2023 and remain well below levels observed in 2022. Mr Speaker, they've got nothing but negativity over there.
Time has concluded. Order. Member for Deakin will cease interjecting. So will the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Give the call to the member for Aston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese government cleaning up the mess of the last decade and laying a stronger foundation for a better future?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Aston for her question. The first question I've ever got from the member for Aston. The previous one was mute, Mr Speaker. was mute for the entire term. But tonight's budget will be a responsible budget. Stronger foundations for a better future. That is what we will be providing tonight. Cleaning up the mess that we inherited. Gross debt was predicted in their budget, and I remind them that we've been in office for less than 1 year. In 2022, their budget predicted that this year gross debt would be $977 billion, almost $1 trillion. They projected a deficit of 3.4% of GDP, or $77.9 billion for this year. I'll make a bold prediction without stealing the Treasurer's thunder tonight. That'll be a bit better than that. I'll make that bold prediction. They had $7.5 billion of unfunded and terminating measures over the forward estimates, is what we were left with. A booby-trapped budget they didn't plan for the future. Now, this time last year, those opposite handed down a budget without a single dollar in savings. Not one, not a single dollar. Yep. But they had a whole lot of expenditure out there, most of which just disappeared as soon as people cast their votes. Their focus was just on the election. Our focus is on the needs of the Australian people, making sure that we look after the vulnerable and those doing it tough, making sure that we strengthen Medicare, making sure that we deal with the skills crisis that we inherited. Now, tonight's budget will be about helping people struggling to make ends meet while not adding to inflation. It will be about dealing with immediate challenges but investing in the medium and long term as well. It will be about providing affordable, effective and targeted cost of living relief, delivering historic investments in Medicare and health, supporting vulnerable Australians, growing the economy and strengthening the budget to make our finances more secure for the future.
Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting immediately, so I can hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Core inflation in Australia is higher than in countries like the US, the UK and Canada, and Australians are hurting. Can the Prime Minister, using his economics degree, explain why his government's—
Order. Members on my right, the Minister for Home Affairs will cease interjecting. Order. Members on my right, I ask to be silent immediately so I could hear from the Deputy Leader. Out of respect for the Deputy, she will start her question again. I'll give her the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Core inflation in Australia is higher than in countries like the US, UK and Canada, and Australians are hurting. Can the Prime Minister, using his economics degree, explain why his government's only answer has been to announce a series of budget measures to spend more and tax more? Why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
I'll give a call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I do have an economics degree. Thank you to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I encourage her to remind people at every opportunity. In case she's wondering, it was from the University of Sydney, and I can bring it in here, and perhaps she could table it and frame it and put it up in her office. Because indeed—
Order.
Indeed, I do use it each and every day. And I use it to know that indeed inflation had taken off well before Labor took office. Indeed, the largest quarterly rise this century was, guess when? Guess when? March 2022. The largest rise in inflation of any quarter this century was on their watch, the last quarter in which they were in office. That is the starting point that my government inherited, a 2.1% jump in 1 quarter. Now, if you do a bit of maths, you don't need an economics degree. 2.1 over a quarter times 4 equals a pretty high inflation rate. And that is That is what they were dealing with. That is what we have had to deal with. Now, after the election, it emerged that the Morrison government had ignored Treasury warnings and it used its final budget to unleash a desperate vote-buying spending spree. They added fuel to the inflation fire. A former government source described it as ordering the entree, the main and the dessert. And the dessert was all there. All the one-off payments, the cash payments were there, not worrying about the impact. And indeed, Australians always pay more under the coalition. We know that the highest taxing government was the Howard government, and the second highest taxing government was Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison.
Order. Members on my left.
The budget papers accompanying the final budget last year showed no surpluses over the forwards. Instead, the coalition was on track to rack up $224 billion in additional borrowings over just 4 years, and the intergenerational report showed the budget would be not in any surplus in any year between now and 2060. 2060. That was their legacy.
Order. Members on my left and right will cease interjecting. The House will come to order so I can hear from the member for Blair. Give the call to the member for Blair.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government cleaning up the mess of a wasted decade under the Liberals and Nationals when it comes to defence?
Give the call to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for his question and acknowledge his contribution to Australian defence policy.
Order.
On the 31st of March in 2021, a day after the Leader of the Opposition had just become Australia's Defence Minister, he announced that the former government was to establish an industrial base in this country for the manufacture of guided weapons. This was done in the finest traditions and with all the hoopla of a Morrison government announcement. Indeed, the member for Cook was on the press release where he said, as the COVID-19 pandemic has shown, having the ability for self-reliance, be it vaccine development or the defence of Australia, is vital to meeting our own requirements in a changing global environment. Well, we all know what they didn't do with vaccines, and they weren't much better when it came to the defence of Australia. The press release also said the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has estimated that Australia will spend $100 billion in the next 20 years on missile and guided weapons purchases. It promised the creation of 2,000 high-tech jobs in Australia, although under the scrutiny of Senate estimates, it turns out that that number was based not on any advice from the Department of Defence. In fact, it was completely made up. Now, the reality of that announcement was very different. Only $1 billion was committed, not nearly enough to see this get going, and the time frame for the beginning of manufacturing guided weapons in this country was not to happen until 2027, a full 6 years after this announcement was made. Promises on the never-never, all fanfare, no follow-up, all announcement, no delivery. On his first full day in the job as Australia's Defence Minister, he sold this country a fantasy. Well, the Albanese government is very different. Announcements are one matter, but we ask to be judged on our outcomes. Over the last couple of weeks, we've committed $2.5 billion to the establishment of a guided weapons enterprise in this country. We've already appointed a 3-star officer, Air Marshal Leon Phillips, to oversee that enterprise, and this is all part of the Defence Strategic Review, which was released on the 24th of April, the first retasking of our Defence Force in more than 35 years. And at the heart of that retasking is giving our Defence Force the capacity for impactful projection, which is why establishing a guided weapons enterprise forms one of our 6 initial priorities to the Defence Strategic Review, because this is exactly the capability our nation needs to keep Australians safe.
Give the call to the honourable member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, during the last election campaign, you identified climate change as the greatest threat to our national security. In May 2022, your government committed to an urgent climate risk assessment by the Office of National Intelligence to help us understand the security risk of climate change. You've now had that report since November. Why hasn't it been released, and when will we see it?
Call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and of course we thank the honourable member for her question. And of course this government has brought a heightened degree of transparency when it comes to climate change to this parliament and to this country. And of course one of the most important things we've done is enshrined in law in the Climate Change Act that the Climate Change Minister must report annually to Parliament on progress against targets and on all other matters relating to climate change and to policies, Mr Speaker. That is something we're proud of having done. I've delivered the first climate change statement and will deliver the second later this year. This is a very important addition to transparency. In relation to national security, we do say that climate change is a very real and significant issue in our national security. That's why the Prime Minister appointed me to the National Security Committee of the Cabinet, for example, to make sure that that is represented around the national security table. Now, in relation to the national security statement, of course, matters that are classified in relation to advice to the Prime Minister of the National Security Committee are treated accordingly. But we have brought that level of transparency, and I'm happy to provide further updates to the House accordingly.
The call to the honourable member for Cunningham.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Aged Care. How is the Albanese Labor government improving the lives of workers in the aged care sector?
The call to the order. Give the call to the Minister for Aged Care and Sport.
I thank the member for Cunningham for her question. I know she cares very deeply about this and is very deeply engaged in lifting the standard of aged care in this country, and I thank her for continuing to work shoulder by shoulder with me on that. The Albanese government is proud to be delivering the largest ever pay rise for aged care workers in history. After 9 years of workforce neglect from those opposite, Labor has made a record investment in our workforce. Our commitment helps more than 250,000 workers across this country, and it means that nurses can earn an extra $10,000 a year. It means that personal care workers can earn an extra $7,000 a year. That is what valuing workers looks like. That's right. That is what care looks like. That is what doing something meaningful to address workforce shortages actually looks like. I have visited 30 aged care homes in the 11 months that I have been the minister, and the number one issue raised with me is staff shortages. We said that we would address the mess left behind by those opposite, and now our budget commits $11.3 billion to addressing their workforce crisis. But this wage rise impacts more than just our tireless and skilled workers. It improves the lives of those who receive aged care as well, and they are just as thrilled for their workers as we are. On the weekend, while door knocking, I met a home care recipient, Rachel, 91 years young, while door knocking in my electorate of Lily. Rachel uses a home care package, and she had her nurse, Elle, from Burnie Bray, over when they watched the Treasurer and I make the announcement on TV last Thursday morning. And Rachel said that Elle actually shouted out loud, and you could hear her from Bribie Island, because Elle has 3 kids, and this announcement that she was getting an extra $200 a week meant that she could buy her kids new shoes for sport. That is what this announcement does. Workers like Elle and care recipients like Rachel are why we committed to this record spend, a spend more than 10 times what those opposite committed to in their workforce pillar to address the workforce crisis, a pillar that could not even improve or commit to improving pay packet structure. In fact, those opposites still refuse to back this funding of a wage rise, even now.
Order. The Order. Members on my right. The minister will resume her seat so I can hear from the manager of opposition business.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, the question was how is the government improving the lives of workers? There was no reference to the previous government, and the minister has repeatedly referred to the record of the previous government.
With 16 seconds to go, I'm going to draw the minister back to her question and ask her to conclude without referring to the matter raised. Give her the call.
With respect to improving the lives of workforce, those opposite on Sunday couldn't even commit to doing it, even now. They would not commit to doing it. They refused to commit to doing it now. And I think they should answer to the 250,000 people whose lives stand to be impacted why they won't even now commit to improving the workforce
concluded. The call to the honourable member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The cost of living crisis under this government is crippling Australian families. David from Merredin Plains in my electorate of Fisher contacted me recently to say he and his wife are trying to support their family of 5 by working 5 jobs between them, working 7 days a week. Prime Minister, why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for his question.
Order.
And I hope that I send my regards through him to David, his constituent and his partner. And many Australians do work damn hard in this country. They work damn hard and they do it tough to put food on the table for their families and to aspire to a better life for their kids. One of the things that you can do, of course, to improve people's situation there is to get wages moving again. It's one of the things that we have been determined to do, and that was recognised by the RBA governor when he said wages growth is stronger than it was a few years ago, which is a welcome development. Is a welcome development. Was very appreciative. I note that the member for Lilly, the Minister for Aged Care, just gave an answer speaking about people in the aged care sector. Now, during the pandemic, we spoke about people who were the heroes of the pandemic, looking after our older, vulnerable Australians during that very difficult time, not thinking of themselves, but thinking of others. And during the pandemic, one of the things that we said we would do is not just give them our thanks, but we said that they deserved a wage rise to be better off. And when the member for Lilly was giving that response about the more than $11 billion that will be in tonight's budget for people in the aged care sector, people who are doing it tough, those opposite just interjected throughout her answer as they continue to be now. When we talk about people who are doing it tough, I can't think of any group who are more deserving in our society than aged care workers, the cleaners, the carers, the orderlies, the nurses, all of those people who are doing it incredibly tough. But increasing wages makes a difference. But people like Mike Baird, former New South Wales Premier, was probably opposed by those opposite, like they oppose other New South Wales Liberal Premiers on everything they've done with this government previously. He said this: "We are incredibly appreciative that the federal government has committed to the increase awarded by the Fair Work Commission and delivered on it. It is truly welcome." And he, of course, is now the chief, or was the chief executive of Hammoncare. He said this: Anyone that's had someone in aged care knows the impact that our aged care workers have. Each day and night they change lives. We support a wage increase for them. Those opposite are silent on it.
Order. Prime Minister's time is concluded. Give the call to the member for Bean.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Government Services. What did the recent hearing of the Joint Committee for Public Accounts and Audit uncover about procurement and contracting in the government services portfolio?
Give the call to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition cannot continue to give commentary when ministers are approaching the dispatch box.
On November the 24th last year, the Age and Sydney Morning Herald disturbingly reported that de facto Canberra lobbying firm Synergy 360 received secret advice from the member for Fadden. I ordered a review into the contracts which may have been tainted. As has been made clear by agency task force representatives and the reviewer, Dr Watt, the review was limited to only looking into the conduct of public servants and not that of vendors, former ministers, MPs and their officers. On April the 14th this year, the JCPAA, chaired by the member for Bruce, held public hearings into the findings of the Watt Review. The member for Fadden's former business partner, political fundraiser and part owner of Synergy 360, Mr John Majerison, gave evidence. The chair's first question to Mr Majerison was, and I quote, "What's APUT?" Mr Majerison was asked by the chair what APUT was. He replied, and I quote from the transcript, "It's the Australian Property Trust. It's a unit trust." The chair then read aloud an email Mr Majerison sent to his Gold Coast accountant, Mr Sean Beasley, about directing who was to receive the profits from Synergy 360. I quote the transcript. On September the 13th, 2017, you emailed your accountant, Mr Beasley, and advised him, FYI, anything that comes in from this in the future, I will end up sending to the Property Trust the same amount that comes in. Mr Majerison went on to say that this trust which he controlled, which was, according to his instruction to his accountant, it was to direct profits from the consulting company derived from Commonwealth contracts. This property trust had as one of its beneficiaries the member for Fadden. I quote the transcript where Mr Majerison explains the member for Fadden's pecuniary interest in the property trust receiving profits from Commonwealth contracts. I had a business relationship with Mr Robert at one point in time. That finished about, give or take, the end of 2018. He would have been a unit holder through whatever mechanism, whether it be his family trust or personally, up until that time, give or take. Money derived from Commonwealth contracts being funnelled through to a member of parliament. The evidence presented to the committee is crystal clear. We know that in a few weeks the member for Fadden is leaving the Australian Parliament, but the evidence is crystal clear. The question for the member for Fadden and the Leader of the Opposition is, did the member ever directly or indirectly seek to or receive a financial benefit from Synergy 360, and is there still a potential benefit owed to him? And a further question to the Leader of the Opposition. Do you endorse the conduct of the member for Fadden in the light of the evidence that we've heard?
Give the call to the member for Flinders.
My question is to the Prime Minister. A family with a $750,000 mortgage is now paying $1,723 more every month compared to May 2022 because this government hasn't taken any action to reduce inflation. Why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Flinders for her question. When it comes to pressure on inflation, one of the things that a government can do is to make sure that when it hands down a budget, it's fiscally responsible. And tonight you'll see the government that I'm proud to lead's response, and compare it with what the coalition, and to be fair to the member for Flinders, she wasn't here to see, quite frankly, the debacle that occurred towards the end of their long office of the Morrison as well as Abbott and Turnbull governments, where we saw the law of diminishing returns, to use an economic term, for the benefit of the Deputy Leader. We saw that. We saw that in place, absolutely. But of course, today the cash rate's 3.85%. But when this bloke was the Assistant Treasurer,
members on my left, the member for Fairfax,
it was 6.75. What's larger, 6.75 or 3.85? You don't need an economics degree. to work that out. What my government is doing on inflation is making sure, unlike those opposite, who of course poured fuel on the inflation fire in last year's budget, after inflation, I remind the member for Flinders that inflation's highest jump this century was in the last quarter of March 2022. The quarter, March 2022.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
I say to the member for Flinders, I'll give the member for Flinders some unsolicited advice. Just say I wasn't here. It wasn't my fault. It all went wrong because since then it has got better.
We'll cease interjecting.
This government, when we had revenue bonuses come in last year, we saved 99%. We put it towards the bottom line. Those opposite, under the government of the law of diminishing returns, the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government, they saved 40%. 40%, which, to be fair, was more than the Howard government ever did. More than the Howard government ever did. And you'll see tonight again what a responsible government looks like.
Interjecting. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition is continuing to interject during question time. If this continues, she will be warned. The call to the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. How will the Albanese Labor government's changes to the single parenting payment deliver targeted cost of living relief?
Call to the Minister for Social Services.
Thank you, Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member for Fraser for that question and for his fierce advocacy for families in his electorate. And of course, I'd like to thank many of my Labor colleagues and indeed many on the crossbench as well for their advocacy on boosting support for single parents. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that this government will expand the eligibility for single-parent payment by increasing the age cut-off from when the youngest child turns 8 to the youngest child turning 14. This will provide 57,000 low-income single parents with an additional $176.90 per fortnight. This measure will strengthen Australia's safety net. And as the Prime Minister said yesterday, this is an investment in families. It recognises that many single parents, overwhelmingly women, have a lot to juggle. The juggle doesn't change when the child turns 8. Our change means that parents will continue to receive a higher payment during the later primary school years and through the critical transition to high school. As children get older, the demands on parenting don't go away, but they do evolve, and single parents are in a much stronger position to take on more paid work as their children get older. But they do need support to get there. Now, I'd like to acknowledge the work by Therese Edwards of the Council of Single Mothers and the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, Sam Mostyn AO, who put significant work into their report and who, of course, also welcomed yesterday's announcement. And they said the reform will allow those who qualify for the payment to be better parents and unlock their untapped economic potential. Both of these women have been consistent and constructive in their advocacy on particular challenges facing single parents, most who are women. I'm pleased that our changes have been warmly welcomed by many advocates and stakeholders, including the Parenthood and the Australian Council of Social Services, who have both called this measure life-changing. The Australian Council of Social Services have said the restoration of the parenting payment is a key recommendation of the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, and the government's changes were incredibly welcome. The Parenthood also said that this change, along with the abolition of the Parents Next program, will greatly help thousands of vulnerable children, parents, mostly mothers, and allow them to have greater financial freedom and flexibility. Our change will ensure single parents have the safety net they need, and our government is focused on families deal with the day-to-day financial pressures while creating more economic security for them over the long term.
Has concluded. The member for Page will be silent so I can hear from the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Environment and Water. Can the Minister advise how many hectares of remnant vegetation that will be cleared for the 106 renewable projects that have received or are awaiting your ministerial approval?
The call to the Minister for the Environment and the Minister for Water.
Thank you so much. I thank the Leader of the Nationals for that question, because it allows me to talk about the fact that I am so proud of the fact that we are approving renewable energy projects at twice the rate of those opposite, because we are committed on this side to a net zero future for Australia. And of course,
members on my left will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Nationals has asked his question.
Land clearing. Yeah, land clearing, of course, is an issue that both state and territory and Commonwealth governments need to address. But I'll tell you what, you don't avoid land clearing by building the coal mines that those opposite say we should be replacing renewable energy projects with. You'd rather not build renewable energy. I'm proud of the fact that I am part of a government that has legislated a pathway to net zero. Those opposite had 22 separate energy policies and they didn't land one of them.
Order. The Minister will take a break. I will hear from the Leader of the Nationals.
A point of order, Mr Speaker, on relevance. It's a very, very specific question around the number of hectares that will be cleared, remnant hectares that will be cleared for renewable projects. It is very specific. Very specific. It's a third. We've ensured a third of her top.
You may resume. Yes, the question did require a number. It was about renewable energy. I want to deal with this issue. Standing Order 104 simply says the minister must be relevant. She's talking about renewable energy. Yes, I know you've asked a specific question, but under the standing orders, she's answering the question directly. If you'd like to change the standing orders, go right ahead. But at the moment, at the moment, that is what you're dealing with on page 53 of standing orders. I'll give the call to the Minister.
Thanks so much, Mr Speaker, and I'm proud of the fact that we want to support upgrading transmission lines across the East Coast grid. We've got $20 billion to invest in that so that we can take the 82% renewable energy that we are committed to achieving in 82 months, great work, get that into the transmission lines, get it into people's homes, get it into people's businesses, bring down their energy bills and bring down pollution in this country as well. We've got a commitment to bring down emissions when it comes to electric vehicles as well.
Order. The Leader of the Nationals will cease interjecting or will be warned.
It's really interesting that those opposite don't want to hear about our plans for renewable energy, our plans to upgrade transmission lines, our plans to bring down emissions, because they had 22 energy policies and didn't land a single one. He's embarrassed by the fact that they never landed a single.
Order.
You know what? I've got 101 renewable energy projects before me right now, and I'm delighted by the fact that we've got more renewable energy projects coming in all the time, because renewable energy is good for the environment, it's good for Australian households, it's good for Australian households, it's good for Australian businesses, because dealing with climate change is one of the best things that we can do for the Australian environment. And the idea that those opposite are against land clearing, given their record, given the record of grasslands, jam lands, the land clearing that those opposite supported.
The time has concluded. Hear from the member for Lyons.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When will Australia's free trade agreement with the United Kingdom come into force, and how will it benefit Australia's businesses, Australia's consumers and the Australian economy overall?
The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Lyons for his question. And indeed, in the United Kingdom, along with Prime Minister Sunak, last week we announced that the free trade agreement would come into force on the 31st of May. That follows the final parliamentary processes being completed in the UK just last week, and our processes being completed before Parliament rose at the end of last year. This FTA opens up new opportunities and delivers significant benefits for Australian businesses and consumers, for Australian farmers and for Australian workers and travellers. It will lift our entire economy. It will eliminate tariffs on nearly all exports to the United Kingdom, making an enormous difference, as I was at the Bondi Green Cafe there in London, one of 14 as part of a business that's been established over the last decade, providing the best food and produce and wine that Australia can produce to UK customers. And that is a good thing. That is a good thing. What it will do is enable the price of those to be decreased substantially. But it will also make it easier for Australians to work in the UK, raising the working holiday visa age from 30 to 35 and increasing the maximum stay from 3 years instead of 2. It will eliminate tariffs on imports from the UK. This will reduce costs to households and businesses and will, of course, therefore have a deflationary impact on our economy. Together with the historic AUKUS partnership, we're strengthening our relationship with a long-standing partner and friend. And I had the privilege of going with the Defence Secretary of State up to Barrow to look at their manufacturing of submarines that occurs there, and where I met Australian workers who are already being trained there as well. The relationships we are building with countries around the world are vital to Australia's strategic interests and to a thriving economy at home. In addition, I met with leaders of the European Union on the sidelines of the coronation to see in what way we could advance the Australia-EU Free Trade Agreement as well. And a lot of work is going into that because that has significant potential benefit for Australia into the future.
The call to the member for Goldstein.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The government has been warned that consulting firms are tailoring advice to earn more money instead of giving frank and fearless advice for the nation. What is your plan to address the innate conflicts of interest between government and big consulting, to shut down this obscene use of billions in taxpayers' money and to enable public servants to be frank and fearless?
The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Goldstein for her question. And one of the things that we have done as a government is to reduce what we regarded as an over-reliance on consultants. We have made sure, and you'll see in tonight's budget, that contrast which is there, making sure that we have put on additional public servants to deal with the challenges that we had with the backlog in visas of 1 million people, to make sure that we deal with issues in government services, which of course were dropping off the shelf if we hadn't have extended funding for services like MyGov beyond 30th of June that were due to end. We make sure, as is reflected tonight as well, that we have indicated to the public service by every single one of my ministers going and not just talking to the Secretary of Departments, but talking to their whole departments, encouraging ideas to come up, encouraging that frank and fearless advice to come to government so that as we go forward we maximise the respect and the capacity of the public service. So I do that personally as well on any occasion. When I visited the UK, we had a meeting with the High Commissioner for all of the staff at the High Commission, the staff who work in defence, the staff who work in Home Affairs, the staff who work in immigration, the staff who work in trade, the staff who work in foreign affairs and diplomatic advice as well. It is, to me, common courtesy that if you treat people with respect, you will get better outcomes. We also had the same approach towards their income and treating them with respect when it comes to proper negotiations between the government and public servants through their union to make sure that that respect is shown as well. The former government did receive some advice about the issue that has come to light when it comes to the Tax Practitioners Board, and indeed the measures that were there from a review into the Tax Practitioners Board was given to the government of the day in 2019, but like so much else, nothing happened. My government is committed to implementing the recommendations of that review.
The call to the honourable member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How will the Albanese Labor government help households with the cost of living through energy bill relief? Have there been any barriers in developing this response?
Call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Order. Members on my left, the Minister hasn't begun speaking. The Minister has the call.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her question and her leadership on matters of climate and energy. And, of course, as the House knows, last year, faced with heightened pressure on energy prices right around the world, we acted. We acted by capping the price of coal and gas, Mr Speaker. That was controversial then, and it's controversial now. The Leader of the Opposition today, just in question time earlier, claimed that capping the price of gas had forced prices up, Mr Speaker. Maybe the Leader of the Opposition should have gone to the University of Sydney to get an economics degree, Mr Speaker. Maybe we'd all be better off if that had happened, because he thinks that lower coal and gas prices lead to higher energy prices. But we've done that and it's had an impact. And we've seen that impact in the draft default market offer released earlier this year, 29 percentage points lower than it otherwise would have been. And as Claire Savage, the energy regulator, has made clear, that is in large part the impact of the intervention by the Albanese government. In large part the impact of the intervention. That has saved up to $1,676 for a Victorian small business each year, Mr Speaker. It's saved up to $530 for a household, particularly South Australian households, $530. And of course we know we need to do more, and tonight we will be doing more. The same legislation—
The Minister for Climate Change and Energy withdraw. The member for Fairfax will withdraw that comment.
I withdraw.
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
The same legislation, Mr Speaker, which enabled that intervention to cap the price of coal and gas enables direct rebates to Australian families and Australian businesses, carefully designed to put downward pressure on inflation by reducing power prices directly compared to what they would have been, Mr Speaker. And I'm pleased to confirm 5.5 million households and 1 million businesses will benefit, Mr Speaker, from that action, and the Treasurer will, of course, outline more action this evening. But there's a third element as well. We understand on this side of the House that reducing emissions and reducing bills are the same thing. We understand that if you make a house or a business more efficient, Mr Speaker, you reduce bills as well as emissions. And we happen to think that's a good thing. Call us old-fashioned. Call us old-fashioned on this side of the House, that we think reducing bills and reducing emissions is a good thing. We know that Australia ranks 58 out of 63 on energy efficiency of households, and we can do better, and particularly low and middle-income households need that support. So again, we will see tonight strong action to help households reduce their bills and emissions, particularly those who need assistance, and particularly small business, Mr Speaker. We've already announced our tax treatment of energy-efficient investments by small business, which will benefit hundreds of thousands of small businesses across the country who want to reduce their emissions and reduce their bills, and we're going to help them do it.
Call to the honourable member for Lindsay.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Under the Prime Minister's cost of living crisis, the cost of gas and household fuels is up 14.3%, tertiary education costs up 9.7%, domestic travel costs up 4.7%. Lifeline says 80% of calls relate to cost of living. 45% of Australians say they are delaying getting their car serviced. The National Youth Mental Health Survey reports cost of living as the biggest concern for young Australians. Why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Order. Give the call to the order. Members on my right. You give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you for that very tight question from the member for Lindsay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I enjoyed going to Lindsay during the state election campaign, Mr. Speaker, and indeed I was there at Penrith. You could have followed the crowd following the new member for Penrith. The new member for Penrith, Karen McKeon, was followed out there.
Order. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Order. Members on my right. The member for Lindsay is entitled to raise a point of order, and I give
Point
it a
of
call.
order relevance. It's Karen McEwen. I just wanted
resume
to
your seat. Resume your seat. That's not a point of order, but thank you for your assistance. The order. The Prime Minister will return to the question.
I note the member for Penrith is there in the parliament on her first sitting day today as the first day of the Minns Labor government. And I congratulate all the members who've been elected there. And at that press conference, the member for Penrith was kind enough to remind me that she was a recruit of the Labor Party many, many years ago. I'm asked about the cost of living and about inflation
on my left.
And I remind the member for Lindsay that the March 2022 quarter, you might want to hear it, but is the highest inflation of any quarter this century. Was on their watch. And the member for Lindsay doesn't have the same excuse as the member for Flinders, because she was here. She was here when that was happening. Those opposite will see tonight a plan to assist vulnerable Australians, as the member for Kingston has just outlined. The plan to help single parents, to make a substantial difference to them. The plans as well that we have to help small business. I note that the Canterbury Bankstown Chamber of Commerce are here in the gallery today, including John Curry, the president or chairman of the Bulldogs. Welcome. And I thank the National Rugby League for their endorsement of constitutional recognition for Aboriginal Australians. That they, along with other groups in civil society, have announced today. But we will have support for small business. We will have support for families. We'll have support for those who need health care. We'll have support to lift wages in the aged care sector. We'll have further support confirmed for childcare that comes in on July 1. We will have a budget that provides support for people who need it, whilst not putting pressure on inflation, unlike those opposite, who didn't provide any support for people except for their mates and put increased pressure on inflation. That's the contrast. That's why this group here have been elected on good economic management, and that's what we're delivering.
Call to the member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. How is the Albanese Labor government making medicines cheaper for millions of Australians? What advice has informed the government's policy, and who will benefit?
Call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Chisholm for her question. I know just how hard she campaigned in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne on our promise to make medicines cheaper. And, Mr Speaker, our government is delivering on that promise. Just last July, we slashed the maximum amount that pensioners and concession card holders would pay for their medicines across a given year by 25%. And in September, we cut the price of 2,000 brands of medicine, putting $130 million back into the pockets of hard-working Australians. And, Mr Speaker, as everyone in this House knows, on the 1st of January we delivered the biggest cut to the price of medicines in the 75-year history of the PBS, putting more than $200 million every single year back into the pockets of hard-working Australian patients. But, Mr Speaker, there is more that the government can and the government should be doing here. Over summer, the peak medicines experts, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, advised our government that more than 300 common medicines for chronic disease should be able to be supplied for 60 days rather than the current maximum of 30 days. Mr Speaker, this would bring us into line with pretty much every country to which we usually compare ourselves, the UK, New Zealand, Canada, France, Germany, so many others besides. It would halve the number of times those patients would have to visit the GP to get a routine repeat script, freeing up millions of GP consults, which everyone in this House knows is desperately needed. And, Mr Speaker, it would halve the cost of those common medicines for 6 million Australian patients living with chronic disease. Medicines for blood pressure, for heart disease, cholesterol, heart disease, Crohn's disease and so much more. And overseas evidence tells us that this extra dispensing arrangement will increase medication compliance by up to 20%. As the AMA said, this is a win for patients, ultimately delivering better health outcomes and taking pressure off the health system. This is good for the hip pockets of Australian patients, Mr Speaker, and it's good for their health as well, which is why a long list of patient groups — I notice that the opposition is simply interjecting with the pharmacy lobby's talking points, not patient groups — Asthma Australia, the Heart Foundation, Diabetes Australia, the Breast Cancer Network, Consumer Health Foundation,
Minister for Climate Change and Energy,
patients group that has opposed
the member
this
for Groom
measure.
and
Mr
the member
Speaker,
Barker
it is not for the
rejecting.
first time that government has got this advice, because 5 years ago the former government got the same advice from the same advisory committee, and instead of choosing the interests of patients, they chose to do nothing. And over those 5 years, hundreds of millions of dollars have been paid by patients when their medicines experts told them they didn't have to.
The member for Gippsland. Give the call to the honourable member for Wentworth.
My question is for the Minister for Industrial Relations. One of your arguments for last year's IR reform was the need to increase wages for childcare workers. 6 months later, no multi-employer bargains have been completed. Childcare workers don't have commitments to increase wages, and some childcare centres in Wentworth, like the one I saw last week, are only offering half the places because of staff shortages. Minister, wouldn't it have been better to fix the awards and make a difference to families and workers now?
The call to the Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and the Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Wentworth for the question. I'll go through a couple of different issues that are raised. First of all, in terms of the award review, which was something that the member for Wentworth sought during the debate and was ultimately negotiated with the Senate as well, with Senator Pocock. There's further discussions that are happening now about the nature of that award review. So the review of the awards, in particular in the context of the new objectives which are in the Act, and those objectives go to both secure employment and to gender equality, which obviously is particularly significant for the rates of pay for people who are working as early childhood educators. In terms of multi-employer bargaining, the different parts of the Act commence on different dates. The multi-employer provisions haven't started yet. So the reason why no multi-employer agreements have been concluded for early childhood education is those sections of the Act don't commence until June. What we have seen, though, is exactly what I predicted, in the sense that immediately we have seen a whole lot of employers come back to the table on individual enterprise agreements with their workforce, workplace by workplace. And that will result And our preference is always, if you can get individual workplaces negotiating and having those agreements in place, that's always the best option. But the problem has been in a whole lot of feminised sectors that hasn't worked. That's why we needed to open up the rules for multi-employer bargaining. They commence in June. So right now we're in a phase where we're seeing a really serious acceleration in the number of negotiations that are happening for enterprise agreements. And I expect the moment that the laws start to open up in June, that's when we will logically see an increase in the engagement with multi-employer bargaining.
The call to the honourable member for Gilmore.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure. How will the Albanese Labor government clean up previous failures affecting the infrastructure investment pipeline and ensure that Australians can believe what the government says when it comes to major infrastructure projects?
Give the call to the Minister for Infrastructure. Order.
Thanks so much for the question.
Can I thank very much? In silence. Oh, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Sorry.
Well, it's been more than fair, and she's a serial offender at this. I'm going to warn her now. I'm just going to allow the Minister to restart her answer and reset the clock. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for the Deputy Leader opposite does this constantly.
Order.
I appreciate the protection of the chair. It is a constant interjection.
Order.
She's doing it even
Order.
now. So can I just say thank you very much to the member for Gilmore for the question. She knows just how important infrastructure investments are for our regions and for our cities. But more importantly, she knows how important it is that when you promise to deliver infrastructure, that it is actually delivered. That is why reforming the $120 billion infrastructure investment pipeline is so incredibly important. The previous government, what the previous government did is they left the pipeline, this pipeline in a total mess, riddled with projects that simply were underfunded, had no funding partner, have not actually had proper cost-benefit analysis done, that have not got support of states and territories. They were poorly scoped, and that they are simply not able to be delivered. We saw the pipeline grow from 150 projects to 800 projects, a large number of which are under $50 million, that simply can never be delivered. Now, if the previous government somehow thought that 800 projects, poorly funded, under scope, not supported by states and territories, that you were going to deliver every single one of those, you've got rocks in your head. That is why we have had to look closely at this infrastructure investment pipeline. We want to make sure that if we promise a project, we actually deliver the project. That is what our regions deserve, it's what our rural communities deserve, and it's what our cities absolutely deserve. Now, the growth in this infrastructure investment pipeline, it won't surprise anyone. Where was the major growth? 2016, 2019. What was happening in that time? There were election campaigns on. That is the way in which you used public money in infrastructure to invest in projects right the way across the country that suited your political purposes so you could put out a press release. And I've said before, you cannot drive on a press release. We are doing the hard work of cleaning up the mess that you have left an incredibly important part of this budget in. The infrastructure investment pipeline, $120 billion, has to be delivered. And it can only be delivered if we look at every project, we look at the costs of those projects, we make sure that we can actually deliver them, that we've got funding partners for them, and we are cleaning up the mess that has been left by those opposite to make sure that we can deliver infrastructure in our rural communities, in our regions, and right the way across our thriving and growing suburbs.
Call to the member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. My constituent Robert Withers lives in Port Macquarie in my electorate of Cowper. His recent electricity bill showed he had reduced his usage by 10% from the same period last year. However, the charges have risen by 40%. The Prime Minister promised Australians like Robert he would cut their power bills by $275, but Robert is now $800 out of pocket in real terms. Why do Australians always pay more under Labor?
Look, I heard the why do Australians. So I'm not. I'll allow order. We can simply move on if you want me to. So everyone just remain silent. The question is in order. Just. Let's remind members, there are time limits, and I'll give the call to the Prime Minister regarding the couple of sentences at the end that were short.
Thank you.
Order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order.
The question. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question is indeed why. Why did those opposite vote against $1.5 billion of energy price relief?
Order.
Why? Why did they?
Order.
Why did the member for Cowper not tell Robert Withers that he voted against $1.5 billion of energy price relief? Why did those opposite oppose cheaper medicines? Why did those opposite oppose cheaper childcare? Why did those opposite oppose an increase in the minimum wage? Why aren't those opposite supporting an increase in aged care workers? Why don't they support any? Why indeed, Mr. Speaker?
The House will come to order. Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting immediately. The Minister for... It's a big day today. Can everyone just remain silent so I can hear from the Manager of Opposition Business? Order. Order. The member for Deakin and the member for O'Connor so I can hear them from the Manager.
On relevance, Mr. Speaker. Why can't this Prime Minister give a straight answer?
Resume your seat. The Manager knows that wasn't a point of order and he does have the MPI today. The Prime Minister will continue with his answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why did they oppose 180,000 fee-free TAFE places to address the skills shortages? Why are they opposing closing the gender pay gap? Why is it that they refuse to come out and support the increase in single parents' payments? Why didn't they support manufacturing jobs through the National Reconstruction Fund? Why don't they support the Housing Australia Future Fund? Why did they oppose their own safeguard mechanism? Why indeed, Mr. Speaker? Why indeed? Because they had 9 years in office.
Order.
Mr.
The Prime Minister will just pause. The member for Wentworth on a point of order. We've already had one point of order on relevance already. So
this is a point of order on disorderly conduct. I don't see that this is orderly conduct for the parliament.
Just going to ask the House to come to order. I thank the member for a point of order. Prime Minister will return to the question.
Mr. Speaker, the question is why. What you'll see tonight is what? You'll see a government that's absolutely committed to providing cost of living relief for people who are most vulnerable who need it. That's what you'll see tonight, and you'll see it in a way that puts downward pressure on inflation, doesn't increase it. That's what a responsible government dealing with the global challenge of inflation is bound to do. And what we will do as well, Mr. Speaker, going forward, is make sure that we are focused on that short term, but always with an eye and strategy for the medium and long term, to make sure that's what our policy on climate is about, cheaper, cleaner energy, driving new industries, driving new manufacturing, and our skills policy to provide people with the employment to do it. That's the what. Indeed, those opposite are so focused on themselves when they look at each other, they just ask themselves, why indeed?
Give the call to the honourable member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Communications. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to support the safety of Australians, and what challenges has the government been facing to deliver on this objective?
I give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank my most excellent colleague for her question. Keeping Australians safe is the core priority of the Albanese government, and that includes online safety, which has traditionally been an area of bipartisanship. This government is now undertaking the substantive work to ensure that the Online Safety Act is successfully implemented, together with our regulator, the eSafety Commissioner. eSafety provides critical support to Australians who experience online abuse. Just to give you some sense of scale, since the 1st of July last year, eSafety has provided support to children, parents and schools in response to over 1,200 complaints under their cyberbullying scheme. eSafety also received over 6,000 reports of image-based abuse and completed over 12,000 investigations in relation to illegal and restricted content. But the eSafety Commissioner is also dealing with new and emerging online harms, including challenges posed by generative AI, which can be used to make what are called deepfakes. When generated with malice, deepfakes can be incredibly harmful. It's particularly concerning to hear about this technology being used to target women, who we know are more likely to experience online abuse that is personal, sexualised and violent. eSafety has powers to remove deepfake images that constitute image-based abuse. And as these technologies are adopted more widely, eSafety's work will continue to be relevant and a high priority of this government. But despite this, Mr Speaker, eSafety faces a funding cliff, thanks to the decisions made by those opposite, who left the regulator with a host of non-ongoing or terminating funding measures. After the 30th of June, eSafety's overall funding would more than halve. Mr Speaker, the question asks about safety, and those opposite like to announce how important various agencies and programs were, but they left them seriously underfunded. And we discovered this not only in respect to eSafety, but also the viewer access satellite television service and other areas where Australians rely on the government to keep them safe and connected. For example, they announced a Cell Broadcast national messaging system to ensure Australians can receive critical emergency warnings. But, Mr Speaker, they actually underfunded it, so it couldn't actually proceed. But, Mr Speaker, last week I announced that our upcoming budget ensures this critical project can be delivered, as well as public safety mobile broadband, yet another vital safety project that languished under the previous government. The Albanese government is left once again to clean up the mess left by those opposite, but we're getting on with the job of delivering a better and safer future for all Australians.
Give the call to the honourable member for Durack.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister promised cheaper electricity bills, cheaper mortgages, no changes to superannuations. Australians would be better off, interest rates would be lower and cost of living would be lower, and Kevin Rudd would not be the ambassador to the US. Why has the Prime Minister broken every one of these promises?
Give the call to the... It was about the election, about the Prime Minister's commitments. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
What we promised at the election, Mr Speaker, was a better future. And tonight's budget will provide a stronger foundation to achieve that better future.
The member for Groom is warned.
To achieve that better future. The Minister for Communications just outlined the issue with the Office of the eSafety Commissioner, which funding would end on June 30, under the provisions made by those opposite. But it's not alone. Child and youth mental health programs, stop funding.
Order.
Family violence prevention, legal service providers. MyGov,
Members on
my health record
left.
would not exist were it not to be funded by us in this budget, because it dropped off on the 30th of June. Of course, the issues such as the National Library of Australia, Trove, which has been so important for researchers, again, no funding. Australian Radioactive Waste Agency, the funding for nuclear waste management, slated to end in December 2023. And then there are the examples of unfunded and underinvested programs going forward. There were big announcements from the former Prime Minister about the Brisbane Olympic Games. Unfortunately, not a dollar of funding. Not one for the Brisbane Olympic and Paralympic Games. Nothing for the Commonwealth Biosecurity operating cost shortfalls. Nothing for Questacon operations to be fixed up. Nothing for the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust that was needed. The underinvestment in Commonwealth national parks like Kakadu. We've got in a building just down the road here, it's called the National Art Gallery. It has one painting, thanks to Gough Whitlam and his vision, that is worth half $1 billion. One artwork. And yet you have buckets because you have water dripping from the leaky roof, due to underfunding. My government is getting on tonight with putting together a budget that tackles the immediate challenges, that better shares opportunities and lays the foundation for a better and more secure future.
Give the call to the member for Pearce.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness. What were the outcomes of the recent Housing Ministers' Council meeting, including in relation to the housing legislative package that is before the Parliament?
The call to the Minister for Small Business, the Minister for Housing and the Minister for Homelessness.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Pearce for that important question. She, like many of us in this place, would like more social and affordable rental homes in their electorates right across the country. Indeed, Mr Speaker, that is what we're trying to do. And we had the fourth Housing Ministers meeting in Canberra last week,
member for Deakin,
where we discussed the broader, ambitious housing policy of the federal government. Indeed, we talked about the whole reform agenda, but critical to that agenda, but not the only thing we're doing, of course, is the Housing Australia Future Fund bill. The $10 billion the Housing Australia Future Fund that will be there in perpetuity with returns every year invested in more social and affordable housing right across the country. And indeed, this was our election commitment, Mr Speaker. We took it to the last election. And when we, of course, had it in this chamber, in the House of Representatives, those opposite voted against it, except, of course, for the member for Bass there. I want to thank all the crossbench again for their support for it. But, of course, the Greens party didn't vote at all. And when it was considered by the housing ministers last week, every single one of them, including the Liberal minister from Tasmania, signed a letter urging senators to pass this bill. And I want to read some of this letter to the House today. The letter says, "The Housing Australia Future Fund is an important step towards providing more Australians a safe and secure home. It provides an ongoing stream of Commonwealth funds to support the delivery of social and affordable housing." It was signed by all 8 housing ministers from right across the country. But of course, it's not just the housing ministers that are supporting this fund. Critically, it's the people on the front line. The people who are providing homelessness services, Mr Speaker, people who are building houses, the construction sector. National Shelter is supporting the bill and wants it passed by the Parliament. Homelessness Australia supports the bill and wants it passed by the Parliament. Community Housing Industry Association supports the bill and wants it passed by the Parliament. The Master Builders, the Housing Industry Association, both support the bill and want it passed by the Parliament. Industry Superannuation wants the bill supported by the Parliament. all of the sector that is involved in supplying more social and affordable rental homes is supporting this bill. So I say to the members opposite and to the Greens party, talk to your senators. Tell your senators to support this bill. The time for political grandstanding and for the games is over. There are vulnerable Australians out there today who are relying on this bill to get passed so we can get more social and affordable homes on the ground for those Australians that need it most.
Call. The Minister is tabling a document.
Yes, I'm tabling the letter signed by the Housing Ministers.
The member for Hughes.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, you promised Australians cheaper mortgages, but after 10 interest rate rises in a row on your watch, the average borrower is now paying 62% more in repayments than in 2020. And in almost half of New South Wales postcodes, the average repayment is more than 40% of median income. Prime Minister, why do Australians always pay more under Labor?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I'll begin the question and then ask the Housing Minister to make some further remarks, because I haven't given myself other jobs, unlike my predecessor. Can I say that the interest rates now, we understand, are placing pressure on families, but they are less than when her leader of the opposition was the Assistant Treasurer. That's just a fact.
Order.
And if we are going to deal with housing issues, I'd say very simply that there is one thing that they could do today, which is vote for the Housing Australia Future Fund that is before the Senate. Because another thing that people learn in economics degrees is supply and demand. If you have more houses, you will have an impact on price. Is a product of supply and demand. There is a bill before the Senate. There is a bill before the Senate right now that will lead to 30,000 additional social and affordable homes being built for people in need in this country. Those opposite will have no credibility. Whether it's those opposite here or the Greens political party will have no credibility on housing issues while they stand in the way of the Housing Australia Future Fund. And I see if the Minister wishes to add to the end.
Call to the Minister for Housing, Home Assistance and Small Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is absolutely right. When the Housing Ministers met in Canberra last week, the Supply and Affordability Council Chair addressed the Housing Ministers, and she said the answer to the questions around housing today are supply, supply and supply. And that is what we're trying to do with the Housing Australia Future Fund, add to supply. It is part of our broad spectrum of housing policies that include, of course, that National Housing Accord, that include the $575 million that we have already unlocked, that has got houses being built on the ground today for Australians. It includes the regional first-time buyer guarantee that we brought forward, so more regional...
The Minister will pause. The Minister for Cyber Security and Home Affairs will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, the question was about the interest being paid by people buying housing in the private housing market. An answer about supply through the Housing Council has nothing to say about the prices that people are paying today on their mortgage. The Minister should be directed back to the question.
I'll listen carefully to the Minister. She was talking about housing supply and I'll make sure she links that to the question regarding the price of the issue of interest rates, but I'll give her the calls. It is relevant, but I'll give her the call. I'll listen carefully to what she's saying.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I'd say to the member opposite, the issue here in Australia is that we do have a supply issue. We have less homes per 1,000 people in Australia than the OECD average, and that has been going on for a long period of time, which is why we need to build more, which is what the National Housing Accord is about. It's an ambition to build 1 million homes from 1 July 2024, Mr Speaker, and we have an agreement with the states and the territories and with the construction sector to actually get these homes up and running. We have the states that are going to respond to the National Cabinet, and the planning ministers are also going to meet around actually unlocking supply so that we can put downward pressure on housing prices. That is what we are doing.
The call to the honourable member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Water. How is the Albanese Labor government caring for our environment and heritage after a decade of neglect?
Call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, our government is absolutely determined to protect more of what is precious, repair more of what has been damaged and manage nature better for the future. And nobody knows the state of Kakadu National Park and Uluru Katajuka National Park better than the member for Lingiari. Formerly the state MP, now the federal MP for Kakadu, 10 years as the head of the Northern Lands Council. She knows it like the back of her hand. And she knows that it has been neglected and let down by those opposite for more than a decade. Those opposite hid the State of the Environment report, and you know why? Because they left the state of the Australian environment in a bad state and getting worse. In contrast, what are we doing? We are doubling funding for Commonwealth national parks like Kakadu, like Uluru Katajuka, like Gurari, like the marine parks, because we know that what has been happening is the slow decline of our national parks. In Kakadu, you've got crocodile signs missing. You've got campgrounds and tracks that are shut to tourists because they're not safe. And we want to make sure that these properties are protected for the future. Sydney Harbour Federation Trust, we have invested $45.2 million because what we were left by those opposite were these properties in a state of disrepair. I visited with a number of local members to see the cracked seawalls, the convict-built architecture falling into the harbour, and we can't afford to let our national estate decline in this way. What you'll see from us tonight in the budget is a doubling of funding for those Commonwealth national parks. You'll see an extra $163 million for the Australian Institute of Marine Science. In Townsville, they had a whole wing of laboratories closed because the machinery's out of date, there's mould in the roof and the offices aren't safe for our scientists to use. So we're doubling funding for the Australian Institute of Marine Science as well, left unfunded by those opposite. This will create 100 extra jobs in Townsville. It'll create 110 extra jobs in our national parks. Many of them, of course, will be held by First Nations Australians, and I'm very proud of that. That means a better tourism experience for people visiting our national estate, and most importantly, it means the places that are special for Australians, the plants and animals that are at risk will be better protected for us, for our kids, for our grandkids.
The call to the honourable member for Wannon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker.
Order. The House will come to order. Order. I will hear from the member for Wannon in silence. Order. The Prime Minister will cease objecting. Members on my right. The member for Gippsland. Give the call to the member for Wannon.
My question is to the Prime Minister. With Australians facing record net overseas migration of 715,000 over the next 2 years, why is there no plan to address the further pressure this will put on cost of living, with increased rents, a worsening housing crisis, longer hospital wait times and increased congestion in capital cities? How much will Australians pay for Labor's Big Australia policy?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Well, that was worth waiting for, Mr Speaker. That was worth waiting for. And on that I make 4 points. 1, those opposite are opposed to increased supply of housing that's in the Senate at the moment over the Housing Australia Future Fund. 2, migration numbers that they projected before the pandemic would have seen a higher population today than are now present. That's
the member
the
for
second
Wannon
point.
has asked his question.
The third point is because there was
Order.
a pandemic.
Members on my left.
Because there was a pandemic in areas such as education, which is a great asset to Australia, a great export that we have, our largest services export, we used to have, say, call it 100,000 students coming in and 100,000 students finish their university degree or degree, and then they leave. Because of the pandemic, we have people coming, but they're not going yet. Hence, you have a spike.
Order.
Hence, you have a spike in numbers which is there. And four.
The member for Wannon has asked his question.
I commend
Will cease interjecting.
to the Shadow
Minister for Home Affairs.
our migration plan announced by the Minister at the National Press Club. He should have got along. Next time I'll shout him a ticket. Because we have minister after minister in the last fortnight standing up at the National Press Club talking about directions.
The Prime Minister will pause. Order. The member for Bendigo will cease interjecting. The member for Wannon on a point of order.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, the 715,000
Order.
net overseas migration number.
The member for Wannon will resume your seat. Yeah. The member for Wannon has been here long enough to know that it is an abuse of standing orders. You simply don't get up to the dispatch box and start speaking. If he does that again, he'll be asked. He's done it before. If he does it again, he'll be asked to leave the chamber. Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, to be fair, it's been a while since he got a question. It's been a while, Mr Speaker. But I commend the Shadow Minister to have a read of the magnificent speech by the Minister for Home Affairs outlining why Australia's over-reliance on temporary migration by those opposite is not in Australia's national interest, outlining why it is in Australia's national interest to get the right migrants in the right places in order to help our economy. And as the Minister said, that if you look at the plan, it's certainly not about an increase, it's about getting the right mix of migration. As the Minister said on page 1 of the paper.
Order. Give the call to the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Arts.
Order.
How has the Albanese Labor government changed previous approaches in order to recognise the importance of the national collecting institutions to Australia?
I give the call to the Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Canberra for the question and acknowledge the member for Canberra her strong advocacy for the national collecting institutions, because all of those national collecting institutions, whether it be the Portrait Gallery, the National Gallery, the Archives, the National Museum, whether it be Bundanon, whether it be the Maritime Museum, all of them have the same essential job, which is to tell the story of Australia. Now, they also, because of the way they've been mismanaged over the last decade, they also tell a story about economic management. And it's not a story you would want to tell. The first concept of economic management with respect to these institutions should be, if you start with the concept that they hold our most valuable items, you probably want to protect them. You probably don't want, in the National Gallery, our most valuable artworks to be in a building that leaks. You probably, if you're talking about the National Library, you think, what do you have to do to look after a book? Starting principle, you don't put it in the water. But for the National Library, it wasn't just the roof that was leaking, it was the windows that were leaking as well. But to go one better, at the National Maritime Museum, the pontoons were sinking. So it wasn't enough for them to have the water coming down from above. At the National Maritime Museum, they were trying to get the museum itself to fall right down to sea level. And that's the way they left it. And why was it left this way? Because each of these organisations, already underfunded, was facing a funding cliff. When the Prime Minister went out to announce the new funding with the Minister for Finance out at the National Gallery, the member of staff who took us through the National Gallery was their Director of First Nations. You would think an essential position at the National Gallery. But under their funding, that position had to be funded through donations. This was not an add-on position at the National Gallery. This was the Director of First Nations. That's what the person was in charge of, and even that position was not funded. Well, as of this year, the funding cliff has gone, and these organisations now will be funded for the workers to now know they still have a job, for the organisations to know that they now can plan for the future for the first time, and finally for these organisations to know that we will no longer have a situation where the items in the museum are in a place with silica dust flying into it, that now our national institutions will be protected as they always should have been.
Call to the honourable member for Casey.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. EY economist Sherelle Murphy says additional net spending in the budget makes inflation worse, whatever its form, saying, and I quote, "The cost will potentially be higher interest rates, which households and businesses cannot afford." Why do Australians always pay more under Labor?
Of course.
Call to the Prime Minister.
I sincerely thank the member for that question. In April of last year, in PFO, as a result of the March budget that was in that last week so that a government could cling on for a bit longer, that didn't have an agenda, it projected the budget deficit this year in 2022-23 to be $77.9 billion. That was the prediction. And of course we know that the government, again, I give credit to the member here, I dissociate yourself from the past, because what he mightn't be aware of is that the largest deficit in Australian political history was by the coalition that preceded. The second largest deficit in Australian history was those opposite as well.
The member for Deakin is on a warning.
When you have a political party that the last time it was in charge of the Treasury benches produced Australia's largest ever budget deficit in history, the time before was the second largest budget deficit in history. They got all the prizes. If you had a pedestal there, like up at the Olympics, they'd be there getting the gold medal, silver medal and bronze. Gold, silver and bronze. You'll see tonight what a responsible budget looks like.
Give a call to the honourable member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. What support does the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament have in our Australian community?
Give the call to the Minister for Indigenous Australians.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Today I welcome news that the NRL formally supports an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. And I'm glad to see that we've got some dogs people up in the galleries. How are you? That's my team. First Nations communities have deep bonds with rugby league and are part of the game's fabric at all levels. From Joel Thompson to Nico Himes, from Jonathan Thurston to the great Latrell Mitchell. The NRL and GI, of course. The NRL would be unrecognisable today without the enormous contribution of Indigenous players. The NRL joins an amazing list, and the support is growing day by day. The NRL, the Australian Olympic Committee, Tennis Australia, the Collingwood Football Club, the West Coast Eagles Football Club, Carlton and Adelaide, and the great Eddie Betts said this: "It's a small step, but I think it's the right step, to have a voice to be heard." I've taken the time over the past 12 months to speak to elders, community members and people I trust to get more information about The Voice. I feel like it's the opening of a pathway to make sure we're included and respected in decision-making on issues. And as Peter Fitzsimons in the Herald wrote, to be able to look back with pride in decades to come on the fact that it was on the right, that sports in Australia was on the right side of history, a bit like Peter Norman was at the Mexico Olympics supporting black athletes on the podium. But it's not just the NRL. It's Qantas, Wesfarmers, Woolworths, the Law Council, the Business Council of Australia, the ACTU, FECA, the Arab Council of Australia, the Imam Council of Australia, all state and territory First Ministers, religious charities too numerous to mention, all churches, university, and most importantly, tens and tens of thousands of individuals. Can I just say that this will make a practical difference on the ground, and that's what The Voice will do. And over the next few months, thousands of conversations will happen across this country about what The Voice is and why it is needed now. It will make a difference. And I know, I have absolute faith in the Australian people saying yes.
Call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 28 questions, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.